No fridge, no freezer, no foil. Yet somehow the Romans made food last for months, sometimes years. They didn't have leftovers hiding behind a carton of milk. No late-night runs for takeout. If you wanted to eat tomorrow, you had to know how to work with nature because there was no safety net. Roman kitchens were all about survival. They used salt like gold, filled the air with smoke, and even hauled snow down from the mountains just to keep food from spoiling. Some of it was genius, some of it was a little questionable. And a few methods, let's just say they wouldn't pass a health inspection today. And surprisingly, a lot of those old methods still work. From fermented cabbage to peacock sealed in honey, today we're stepping inside the pantry of the past to see how the Romans preserved their food without a single watt of electricity. Ready to time travel with your taste buds? Let's start with salt. Among the many tools of the Roman kitchen, salt held a place of unrivaled importance. In our modern age, it is little more than a seasoning, scattered carelessly across meals. But in the Roman world, salt was the cornerstone of survival. It preserved life as surely as it preserved meat. The Romans possessed a profound understanding of a simple truth: moisture bred decay. Wherever water lingered, so too did the seeds of rot. Salt, by contrast, drew that moisture out. It desiccated flesh, hardened surfaces, and in doing so, held the forces of spoilage at bay. Fish, pork, beef, even vegetables were all subjected to the same ritual. Meat was encrusted in heavy quantities of salt, sometimes equal to 1/5 of its own weight. Then it was suspended in shaded storerooms, laid upon drying racks, or sealed within thick ceramic vessels. Over time, salt formed a crust, impermeable, inhospitable to pests, and strong enough to preserve the contents within for weeks, sometimes months. This same salt gave rise to one of Rome's most famous exports, garum, and we know it worked. In Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered sealed amphorae still filled with garum after nearly 2,000 years. The residue was so well preserved, scientists could analyze its chemical composition and even detect its distinct pungent aroma. In great open vats, fish and salt were heaped in layers and left beneath the sun. The process was slow, driven by fermentation and heat. But in time, the mixture released a rich, pungent liquid, the beloved fish sauce of the empire. Garum was poured over meats, grains, legumes, and even fruit. It was as much a flavoring as a necessity, capable of masking spoilage and making even army rations palatable during long marches across provinces. Salted provisions, particularly fish and pork, became standard fare for the Roman legions. Soldiers often softened their rations in diluted wine or vinegar before consuming them. The taste was harsh, the texture unyielding. But in distant provinces where supplies were uncertain, salted meat meant survival. So prized was salt that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it, giving us the word salary from salarium. Salt, at times, was used quite literally as payment. In poorer territories, a single measure could be bartered for a full day's labor. Yet not all households had ready access to vast stores of salt. For those who sought other means, or greater longevity, smoke became the next ally. Smoke. If salt was the Roman shield against decay, then smoke was its sword. To enter a Roman kitchen was to step into a realm of flame and haze. Suspended from beams above the hearth were links of sausage, lengths of eel, hams, and even wheels of cheese, all slowly turning golden beneath a veil of rising smoke. These were not decorative tokens. They were part of a daily, deliberate craft. Romans understood that smoke served not only to flavor, but to guard. It dried food as salt did, but added something more, a smoky barrier, capable of repelling insects and resisting rot. In a warm Mediterranean climate, this was no small feat. The hearth, central in nearly every dwelling, served as the engine of this method. Meat was hung in its path, left to cure over many days. There were no chimneys. Smoke collected beneath the roof, darkening rafters and saturating whatever it touched. The process was imprecise but effective. Wood was chosen with care. Olive produced a soft and fragrant smoke. Oak brought strength and depth. Beech yielded a clean and balanced aroma. Each type imparted a distinct character to the meat it enveloped, and the more refined Roman kitchens knew precisely which wood to burn for each cut. Over time, those who could afford it constructed smokehouses, small, purpose-built chambers, with vents to control airflow and shelves for aging larger portions. These structures, often found on country estates, became the backbone of year-round food storage. And this technique endured over distance. Historical records speak of smoked cheese shipped from Rome to Alexandria, surviving a journey of more than 1,000 miles without spoilage. It was a testament to the method's success and to the Roman mastery of adaptation. So we've salted and smoked, but what if you needed snow in July? Cold storage. Not all provisions could be cured with salt or smoke. Some, delicate in nature, required coolness, a gentler stillness, to endure the Mediterranean heat. And the Romans, ever resourceful, devised elegant methods to command the cold. Beneath the villas of patricians and merchants, there often lay a cella, a chamber carved into stone or earth, hidden from the sun, sealed from warmth. These subterranean rooms, though simple in construction, held a constant, blessed chill. Even at the height of summer, their temperature rarely rose above 15 degrees Celsius. Here, wine casks aged in peace. Fresh cheeses rested unspoiled. Olives floated in oil. Fruits, nuts, and greens lingered a little longer before succumbing to time. But there were those who sought not coolness alone, but ice. And for them, winter was a season of gathering. During the colder months, laborers were dispatched to high altitudes, the Apennine Mountains, the Alban Hills, to collect snow. With great effort, it was brought down in sledges and carried in baskets to the estates of the powerful. There, it was packed into pits, layered with straw or sawdust, and buried deep beneath villas in specially built chambers known as Nivaria. These ancient ice houses were feats of both engineering and ambition. Some could hold several tons of snow, preserved well into the heat of midsummer. And their purpose was not solely indulgent. The snow cooled wine at imperial banquets. It preserved fresh fish from distant coasts. It formed the base for desserts flavored with honey, citrus, and grape must, what poets would later describe as sorbet fit for the gods. To possess a snow cellar was to command a piece of winter all year long. It was a symbol of wealth, yes, but also of foresight. For in a land of sun, the one who mastered cold could preserve life. Yet snow, like all things, melted, and when it did, the Romans turned to a force even more ancient than ice, the power of the sun. Drying. If snow was Rome's rarest gift, sunlight was its most abundant servant, and the Romans, patient and observant, learned to wield it with precision. Drying food beneath the sun was a practice as old as the fields themselves. It required no fire, no salt, no costly tools, only air, heat, and time. Across the provinces, particularly in the countryside, it was common to find wooden racks brimming with fruit, figs, grapes, plums, slowly darkening into sweet, leathery jewels. These dried treasures were tucked away in earthen jars and linen sacks, ready to nourish a household through famine, storm, or siege. The dried fruits were not merely sustenance, they were delicacies. At banquets, figs were soaked in wine and honey, raisins adorned stews and cakes, dried apples and pears were rehydrated in mulled drinks and served to esteemed guests. Beyond fruit, herbs too were preserved by the sun's hand. Oregano, thyme, mint, rosemary, all were bound in bundles, suspended from beams, and left to crisp and concentrate. Onions and garlic were braided and hung in kitchens. Even mushrooms, sliced thin, were set on stones to dry, then sealed in cloth pouches. In regions such as Gaul and Hispania, the process reached industrial scale. Drying towers, tall, narrow structures with slatted walls, allowed vast quantities of produce to be preserved at once. Warm air rose through the structure, drying thousands of pounds of goods without flame or fuel. It was nature, harnessed. Even bread, when stale or leftover, was not discarded. It was sliced and dried into hard rusks, durable as stone, carried by soldiers on campaign and soaked in broth or wine when meals were scarce. These unyielding loaves, like the men who bore them, were built to endure. Drying was more than technique. It was a philosophy, a belief that with care, foresight, and sunlight, the bounty of the land could be stretched across seasons, across distances, even across generations. And so, under Roman roofs and in Roman fields, the sun was not merely a source of light. It was the guardian of harvests, the slow fire of preservation, and the quiet architect of survival. Enjoying this ancient pantry tour? Hit the subscribe button before we preserve the rest. Fermentation. When salt was scarce and smoke impractical, the Romans turned to a subtler force, fermentation, the invisible alchemy that transformed perishables into provisions. What began as a necessity soon evolved into a culinary philosophy, woven into the very fabric of Roman domestic life. In the kitchens of Rome, great amphorae lined the walls, tall, narrow jars sealed with wax or pitch, each containing a different bounty suspended in brine or vinegar. Olives of every hue, beets, onions, turnips, and cucumbers, all preserved beneath liquid, layered with herbs, spices, or fragments of garlic and mustard seed. These were not mere side dishes, but staples, meant to nourish a household throughout the barren months. The most common preserving agent was posca, a cheap, vinegary soldier's drink. It was sharp, simple, and effective. Food immersed in it resisted decay, carried the bite of acidity, and gained a resilience that defied heat and time. Some households sweetened their brines with honey, creating a complex balance of flavors, sweet, sour, and sustaining. Fermentation was not limited to plants. Fish, too, found new life in brine. So did cheese, especially the softer varieties, which were submerged in salted whey to firm and mature. Fruits were also transformed. Quinces and grapes, crushed and aged until they gave rise to sour-sweet pastes and spreads that were served with bread, cheese, or roasted meats. Physicians of the age, like Galen, praised fermented foods not merely for their endurance, but for their health. Pickled cabbage, for instance, was prescribed for digestion, gut balance, and even melancholy, long before anyone knew what vitamin C was. Soldiers carried it in ceramic pots across provinces. Tavern keepers, too, found a use for the fermented egg, preserved in ash, vinegar, or wine, served alongside wine and coarse bread as a satisfying snack. In every corner of Roman society, from the legions on the march to the villas of the elite, fermentation was a quiet guardian, stretching seasons into sustenance, deepening flavor into memory, and turning simple brine into a pantry's best defense. Honey. Yet even fermentation had its limits. For food that was truly precious, that needed to endure not for weeks but for years, the Romans turned to one element above all others: honey. Golden, viscous, and incorruptible, honey was regarded not just as food, but as nature's preservative, bestowed by the gods. Its natural antimicrobial properties made it uniquely suited for long-term storage. And so, the Romans used it not sparingly, but lavishly. Fruits were peeled and packed into clay jars, then submerged in honey and sealed. Apples, berries, nuts, and even grapes could survive for years in this sugary embrace. Meats were treated with similar reverence. A recipe in the writings of Apicius, Rome's most famed gastronomer, details the preservation of peacock, roasted, basted in honey, and sealed within amphorae. To modern ears it may seem indulgent, but for the Roman elite, it was a testament to their mastery over both time and nature. Across the countryside, wealthy estates maintained their own apiaries. Beehives were placed near flowering groves and orchards, producing honeys of distinct flavor: thyme, chestnut, acacia, and clover. Honey was collected by skilled keepers, whose bees had rights recognized in law. If a swarm settled on neighboring land, the hive's owner retained claim to its bounty. These hives supplied not only the kitchen, but the storerooms and infirmaries. Honey sealed amphorae with airtight certainty, It was smeared upon wounds as a balm. When mixed with vinegar, it soothed sore throats. Combined with mint, it calmed the stomach. So revered was honey that many Roman homes had honey rooms, dry, clay-lined pantries where sealed jars rested for years. In one such vessel, unearthed by archaeologists, honey mingled with walnuts, still fragrant after nearly 2 millennia. One amphora, recovered near the ancient city of Eleutherna in Crete, contained honey and nuts so well preserved that traces of pollen, wax, and floral compounds were still detectable. Researchers noted the honey remained biologically stable, even after 2,300 years. Wine. Where honey gilded food in sweetness, alcohol served as yet another invisible shield. The Romans, keenly aware of its preservative power, made wine do more than inspire feasts. It preserved the very dishes served upon the table. Fruit was poached in wine, then sealed in amphorae. Plums and pears were simmered with cinnamon, cumin, or fennel, then drowned in sweetened must. Over time, the alcohol infused their flesh, repelling spoilage and deepening their flavor. Even humble ingredients found protection in a drink. Garlic cloves, onions, and boiled eggs were placed in jars of red wine, spiced with pepper or bay. The wine did not merely preserve, it softened, marinated, and transformed. One recipe, favored among elite households, involved alternating layers of pear slices, submerged first in white wine, then red, to produce a striped mosaic of color when poured into glass vessels. These preserved fruits and spiced preparations were often exchanged as gifts between noble families. In times of war, jars of wine-preserved cherries were sent to soldiers at the empire's fringes, both as comfort and sustenance. And in homes, it was not uncommon to find meats cooked, cooled, and stored in wine for safekeeping, especially during long journeys or banquets prepared days in advance. Wine, though born of fermentation, ascended beyond it. In the Roman world, it became both ritual and preservative, flavor and fortress. Clay storage. None of these methods, fermentation, honey, alcohol, could endure without the right vessel, and for this, Rome relied on one of its oldest technologies, the ceramic jar. From the smallest urni to massive dolia, Roman storage jars were architectural marvels. Crafted from porous clay, they were fired, coated, and sealed with resins, pitch, or wax, rendering them both breathable and airtight. Two contradictory qualities that, together, enabled the perfect balance for long-term preservation. Each jar had a purpose. Narrow-necked amphorae held wine, oil, and vinegar. Wide-mouthed dolia stored grain, salted fish, and garum. Inside, food was layered with care, often with herbs, straw, or cloth to insulate and separate. The outside was no less thoughtful. Many jars were inscribed with details of origin, date, and contents, often stamped or painted before firing. In this way, a merchant in Carthage could recognize oil pressed in Hispania, or wine aged for 20 years near Neapolis. Amphorae were stored in cellae, or buried halfway into the ground to moderate temperature. On ships, they were packed upright in straw and clay, wedged tight to endure the rocking of the sea. Even today, shipwrecks are uncovered with amphorae intact, some still bearing traces of ancient contents. Take the Madrague de Gien wreck off the coast of France. Discovered in 1967, it held over 1,500 amphorae packed with preserved Roman wine. Some amphorae still bore resin seals, and residue analysis revealed compounds like tartaric acid, clear signs of aged grape must. When the jars were full and the salt was gone, Romans turned to their last ally: ash and earth. Ash, taken from the hearth, was dry, sterile, and insect-repelling. In homes across the empire, eggs were buried in clay pots layered with ash and lime, some boiled beforehand, others left raw. Kept cool and dry, they remained edible for months. In the countryside, root vegetables were buried in pits carved just below the frost line. These pits, lined with straw or sand, breathed gently through air shafts to prevent mold. Here, Carrots, parsnips, turnips, and radishes slumbered through winter, their freshness preserved by cold and shadow. Even cheese was sometimes buried, wrapped in leaves, and placed in shallow hollows to age. The result was pungent, flavorful, and utterly Roman. One such delicacy, Maridum, a garlic herb cheese spread, was often made from aged curds and praised in rustic verse. While not always buried, its ingredients reflected the bold, preserved flavors of the Roman countryside. And sometimes, burial was an act of secrecy. In times of famine or war, entire amphorae of grain or oil were hidden beneath fields, marked with coated stones. Families returned weeks or years later to retrieve them, unspoiled, unseen, untouched. To bury food was not an act of desperation, it was an act of wisdom. The ground offered what no fire or salt could: silence, stillness, and time. So that's how the Romans kept their food fresh, without a fridge, freezer, or even foil. Just smart thinking, a lot of patience, and a few tricks that still work today. If you enjoyed this look into ancient kitchens, give the video a like and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Have a preservation method from your own culture, or a time in history you want us to explore? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.